Before you say I told you so, Joshua rasped, prying open a hand frozen around a brass Dalton range tag. Eugenia stood, framed in the cabin doorway, both palms pressed to her cheeks as his ice-caked knee folded against the sill, and the porch lantern burned gold beside her. He had saved her flower wagon, but the tag said someone had tried to steal it, and if he died before speaking, Mattie Jarvis would own the story by morning. The blue norther had come weeks early across the Texas brush country, stripping leaves from the mesquite and turning rain to snow and flying ice. Joshua's knuckles were bone white, the brass disc biting into his skin. He tried to speak again. The wind tore the words away and drove his shoulder into the oak frame. He did not ask to come in. He only held out the Dalton tag like a man paying a toll he could no longer afford. The anger Eugenia had worn that morning still sharpened her face, but she did not hesitate. She seized the collar of his stiff slicker and hauled him across the threshold. "You can stay," she said, slamming the door and dropping the iron bar. "At least until you live long enough to hear me tell you what a fool you are." Joshua slid down the wall and struck the floorboards. The sudden quiet rang in his ears. The cabin smelled of coffee, dried sage, and the dry heat of the iron stove, the particular order of a woman who had prepared for trouble and meant to outlast it. Lamplight fell across a crisp, unsigned offer from Wilma Dalton. Beyond the frosted window, the porch lantern kept burning against the white storm. Joshua tried to uncurl his fingers. They wouldn't move. He looked down at his boots, caked in 3 inches of solid ice, and managed a rough, rattling breath. "Texas," he whispered, his teeth striking together, "doesn't know how to make snow long enough to kill a man. That's what I said." "And the weather," Eugenia replied, kneeling with a knife to cut away his frozen gloves, decided it possessed better judgment than a middle-aged trail boss. Her words were sharp. Her hands were not. She sliced the stiff leather away without touching skin. Joshua closed his eyes. At 42, after 20 years of finding cattle in dust rain and black night, he was supposed to know what the land meant before it spoke twice. Lately, that knowledge no longer felt like enough. For the past 2 months, Mattie Jarvis had been riding the same trails. Jarvis was 27, quick with a rope, flashy with a horse, and loud in front of the ranch owners who signed the winter contracts. Jarvis had made a habit of pointing out whenever Joshua took a little longer to mount up in the morning, or when he checked a track twice. "Old man's gettin' careful," Jarvis would say loud enough for the Dalton foreman to hear. Careful means slow. Slow means dead cows. Joshua had answered the taunts with dry jokes before anyone else could laugh at him. The trick usually dulled an insult. It had not dulled the fear beneath this one, that he was becoming a worn tool, kept only until a younger hand reached for it. So when Eugenia had pointed out the smoke lying low, the cattle turning their rumps north, and the iron smell in the air then warned him of snow before dark, Joshua had laughed. He could not afford to become the careful old man who hid from a storm that might never come. Then he had heard Jarvis boasting at the livery that Eugenia's flower wagon, mired in a shallow draw 3 miles out, was fair game if the widow was too frightened to fetch it. Jarvis said the Dalton outfit ought to manage her supply line for her. Wilma Dalton had spent a year trying to buy Eugenia's cabin and its high-ground spring. If Jarvis brought that wagon into the Dalton barn, he would call Eugenia helpless, and Joshua finished in the same breath. "You're bleeding," Eugenia said, pulling Joshua's thoughts back to the warm cabin. She tossed the ruined leather gloves toward the hearth. "Just a scrape," Joshua muttered, trying to push himself up. His knees screamed in protest, a sharp, grinding ache that told him that he wasn't going anywhere. "I need to check the gelding. Make sure he's out of the wind." Eugenia planted a hand on his shoulder and pushed him down again. "The gelding is in the shed. I put him there after I dragged you inside while you were trying to die politely on my floor." Joshua blinked. He had not heard her go out or return. At 31, Eugenia Ogden had made a reputation out of needing less help than men believed and offering more than they deserved. Her dark hair was pinned in a practical knot. Flour marked her apron, the same flour she sold to riders who would otherwise go hungry when the brush country turned cruel.
"I got the wagon onto the high ridge," Joshua said. "Ran my rope through the wheel and let the gelding take the pull. It's under the limestone shelf." He lifted the tag. "Found this nailed to the tongue. Dalton mark." Eugenia took the disc and rubbed her thumb over the stamped D. Her jaw tightened. "My red flag," she said. "The one tied to the brake handle." "Was it there?" Joshua hesitated. He had seen the frayed cord where the flag had been torn away. Telling her would put Jarvis's insult inside the warmest room she owned. "Wind must have taken it," he lied, looking away. "But the wagon is safe." "I told you to stay out of the north pasture," she said, the sharp edge leaving only tired frustration. She rose and took a heavy wool blanket from the chest at the foot of her bed. "I told you there would be snow before sundown." "I reckoned I had time." "You reckoned," she repeated, throwing the blanket over him. She grabbed a 50-pound sack of flour from the corner and hauled it over, dropping it squarely across his booted feet. Joshua grunted at the weight. "What's that for?" "An anchor," Eugenia said, walking to the stove to pour coffee. "Even a man's pride can't lift 50 pounds of milled wheat when his legs have no feeling. You sit there and thaw, Joshua Boyd. A man of years ought to know when to quit." The words struck exactly where the fear lived. A man of years. He took the tin cup she offered, though his hands shook hard enough to spill coffee over the rim. He said nothing more. He let the returning blood burn through his fingers while the unsigned Dalton offer stirred each time the wind struck the walls. By the second day, the norther had settled into a freezing siege. Frost blinded the windows, and the wind cried through the mesquite. The cabin, built stout by Eugenia's late husband, held its heat. Joshua did not hold his peace nearly so well. Once feeling returned to his limbs, idleness became another kind of pain. A man who could not work had no business taking up space beside another person's fire. Joshua counted the wood, tested the window seams, then began on the kerosene tins. At the table, Eugenia's pencil stopped over her ledger. By his third circuit of the room, she watched him with the particular patience of a woman deciding whether to throw him back into the weather. "There's enough oil for 2 weeks," Joshua announced, tapping a tin with his boot. "And if we ration the salted beef, you won't have to touch the supplies meant for the trail crews until the road clears." Eugenia slowly closed her ledger. She picked up a small, chipped ceramic plate from the counter. On it sat a solid chunk of ice. She walked over and held it out to him. Joshua frowned. "What's that?" "It's the ice I chipped out of your beard yesterday," she said, her expression entirely serious. "I kept it as weather evidence." Joshua stared at it, a dry huff of laughter escaping his chest. "Evidence of what?" "That my organized luck at reading the sky is better than your stubbornness?" She set the plate down. "You need not count my wood, Joshua. I cut it. You need not ration my beef. I cured it. If you wish to help, ask what I need. Do not take command of my house because sitting still frightens you." He stiffened, the urge to deflect rising instantly. "Just trying to earn my keep, Mrs. Ogden. I ain't used to sitting by a fire I didn't lay." "Then get used to it," she said softly. "You do not have to pay for the air you breathe in here." The words left him defenseless. Being allowed to stay without earning it should have eased him. Instead, it made him ache for the chair beside her table,
in a way no wage ever had. Joshua looked at the unsigned offer again. "Wilma Dalton naming a fair price?" he asked. Eugenia followed his gaze. She pulled the paper toward her, her fingers brushing the edge. "Fair for the timber, fair for the high spring, not fair for the fact that it is mine." She looked up at him. "Maddie Jarvis told the livery crowd I would sell by Sunday. Said a woman alone could not keep a winter station through hard weather. Jarvis talks louder than he works. He works well enough to make you ride into a blue norther merely to prove he could not beat you to a wagon," she said without malice. Joshua felt the heat rise in his neck. He looked out the frosted window, unable to meet her eyes. He said, Joshua stopped, swallowing the knot of pride in his throat. He said a broken-down trail boss couldn't hold a winter line, and a widow couldn't hold a high ridge. His fingers tightened around the coffee cup. "I didn't ride out for the wagon, Eugenia. I rode out because I was tired of hearing him plan our funerals." It was the most honest thing he had said in years. He braced for pity or scolding. Eugenia gave him neither. She emptied the melting ice into the wash basin and returned to her dough board. "The wind's going to blow through tomorrow night," she said, burying her hands in the flour. "I have to bake. The hands caught out in the brush are going to come looking for food as soon as the drifts settle." "I'll work the stove," Joshua said, stepping forward. "No," Eugenia said, without looking up. "You will sit at the table. You will keep the lantern trimmed, and you will keep me company." It was a request for his presence, not his labor. The distinction frightened him more than the storm. Joshua pulled out a chair and sat. For once, he did not reach for a tool. The night became a quiet watch against the cold. Eugenia kneaded and shaped while Joshua kept the wick even and counted loaves under his breath. "If you count my bread after counting my wood," she warned, "I shall put the flour sack back on your feet. I am only making certain none escape." The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but he stored it like one. Near dawn, fatigue made her reach for salt instead of sugar. Joshua slid the right jar beneath her hand without comment. She looked at his scarred knuckles, then at his face, and the room went still for one breath too long. He had spent years proving his worth by moving whatever burden stood nearest. Sitting beside her should have felt like uselessness. Instead, when she returned to the dough and left his chair close to hers, it felt dangerously like being wanted. On the third morning, the wind finally died. The sun broke over the horizon, glaring off the blinding white landscape. The brush country was buried, but the sky was clear. Eugenia stood by the stove, pulling the last pan from the heat. Joshua was lacing up his dried boots, preparing to shovel out the porch. "Here," Eugenia said. Joshua turned. She handed him a single, small biscuit, still steaming. It wasn't the standard round trail bread. Pressed into the center of the golden crust was a distinct lopsided U-shape, a crooked horseshoe. It was the exact mark Joshua used to sign his tally books when he brought a herd in, a joke about his own bowed legs. He stared at it while the heat warmed his palm. Eugenia wiped her hands on her apron and tried for a neutral face. The attempt failed at the eyes. "Is the flour mocking me now?" he asked, the dry humor returning, though his voice was quiet. "It is not a joke," Eugenia said. "I kept back a handful of flour for that one." She met his eyes. "I do not save my last flour for replaceable men, Joshua. Stop behaving as though one bad winter will get you thrown away." Joshua stood perfectly still. Warm bread in his palm, fire at his back, and her gaze on him made the cabin feel smaller than it was. He wanted to cross the space between them. He wanted to tell her he had slept poorly ever since she smiled at him over a cattle pen 2 years earlier. Wanting it was easy. Risking the answer was not.
The unsigned Dalton offer still lay on the table between them. Before he could find the words, the sharp, metallic ring of a wagon bell echoed across the snow. The road was opening.
Half an hour later, a heavy buckboard pulled by 4 steaming horses crested the ridge. Wilma Dalton sat on the bench, wrapped in furs, and beside her, driving the team, was Mattie Jarvis. Joshua stepped out onto the porch, his coat buttoned tight. Eugenia stood beside him, the lantern hanging dark on its hook above her head. Jarvis hauled the team to a halt and let his gaze travel from Joshua to Eugenia.
"Well now," he called. "Looks like the old man found a warm skirt to hide behind when the weather turned." As Jarvis lifted a hand from the reins, a scarlet thread showed near the mouth of his coat pocket. It vanished when he dropped his arm. Joshua's gaze remained on the pocket. Jarvis was vain enough to keep proof of any small victory, even when the proof might later turn against him. If the thread belonged to Eugenia's flag, he had not kept it by accident. He had kept it as a trophy. Joshua did not react to the bait. He stayed loose, his hands hanging easily at his sides. Wilma Dalton stepped down, her boots crunching in the snow. She was a hard-eyed woman who measured everything in dollars and acres. "Mrs. Ogden, glad to see you survived. Jarvis here told me your wagon was abandoned in the North Draw. He said Boyd lost his nerve and left it to rot." "He said that, did he?" Eugenia asked, her voice dangerously calm. "I said what I saw," Jarvis shot back as he climbed down. "Boyd wandering before the storm, the wagon standing empty. I put the Dalton tag on it as salvage, seeing as neither of you could manage your own freight." He pointed at Joshua. "You near let her flower freeze because you could not read the sky. You have no business taking winter contracts." Joshua felt the familiar urge to draw back, to make a dry joke, and walk away from the fight. A trail boss who lost a wagon and ignored a storm warning was a liability. If he fought Jarvis here, Wilma Dalton would see a desperate, aging man. But he looked at Eugenia. He saw the fire in her eyes, the fierce pride she took in her station. If he let Jarvis control the story, it wasn't just his reputation on the line. It was hers. Joshua took one step forward, placing himself between Jarvis and the cabin door. But he didn't block Eugenia's view. "I ignored the warning," Joshua said, his voice carrying clearly over the snow. "Mrs. Ogden told me the norther was coming. I was foolish enough to think I knew better. I'll take the blame for the foolishness, and I'll take the loss of the Dalton contract." Wilma raised an eyebrow. Jarvis grinned in triumph. But Joshua continued, his voice dropping an octave, turning hard as flint. "I found that wagon under the overhang, safe. And I found your brass tag nailed to the tongue." Joshua pulled the tag from his pocket and tossed it into the snow at Jarvis's feet. "You can take my job, Jarvis. You can tell everyone I'm too old to track a cow. But you don't get to replace Mrs. Ogden's word with your own. You didn't find that wagon abandoned. You found it parked, and you tried to steal her livelihood." Jarvis flushed red. "She's a woman alone. She panicked and left it. That's enough." Eugenia's voice cracked like a whip. She stepped out past Joshua. She didn't look at Jarvis. She looked directly at Wilma Dalton. "My wagon was secured. My red flag was tied to the brake. Someone tore it off and drove a Dalton tag into the wood, hoping I'd be too ruined by spring to refuse a buyout." Wilma Dalton's eyes narrowed. She turned slowly toward Jarvis, who found sudden interest in the reins. Whatever else Wilma was, Joshua had never known her to excuse theft. "We will discuss this at the ranch, Mr. Jarvis," she said. Then she faced Eugenia. "My offer stands, Mrs. Ogden. The Sunday supply meeting is tomorrow. I expect your answer then." Wilma climbed into the wagon. Jarvis scrambled up beside her, refusing to look at Joshua, and drove the team back down the ridge. The silence returned to the porch. Joshua let out a slow breath. He had publicly admitted his failure and lost the biggest contract in the county. He turned to Eugenia. "I should pack my gear," he said quietly. "If I stay here, Jarvis will start talking. He'll say you only kept the cabin because you had a man doing the heavy lifting for you. I won't let him take your name." Eugenia stared at him, waiting for the dry smile that usually followed his worst ideas. None came. Joshua walked past her and crossed the threshold. One heavy step struck the floorboards, then another. His bedroll and saddlebags rested against the wall where she had set them after the storm. He bent and closed his hand around the saddlebag strap. He meant to lift it. He meant to walk back into the cold before staying beside her could become one more thing the county used against her. Eugenia followed him inside. Before he could straighten, she planted her palm flat against his chest. "You think leaving protects me?" she asked, her voice low. "I think being tied to a trail boss who just surrendered his best contract will not help you build a supply station. Joshua Boyd, you are the most exhausting man in Texas." Eugenia pressed harder until he let the saddlebag fall. "I did not defend you so you could run away in the name of my honor. 20 ranches have sent orders for flour, coffee, and lamp oil. I need someone to ride the high ridge and mark the safe trails. I need someone to help set a lantern signal for night riders. 2 flashes for safe passage, 3 for trouble." Joshua stared at her. "You're offering me a job?" "I am offering you a place," she corrected. "If you possess the courage to stay until you are chosen, instead of leaving before you can be dismissed." Joshua looked at her. He saw the strength she used to hold the world at bay, and the narrow, deliberate space she had opened beside herself. No one had ever frightened him by asking him to remain. 2 flashes for safe passage, he said. "I can do that." He swallowed. "And I can stay." The Sunday supply meeting was held in Eugenia's cabin. Mud from a dozen ranch hands' boots tracked across the floorboards as they lined up for their weekly rations. The air was loud with talk of the storm-lost cattle and the miracle of the High Ridge wagon being safe. Wilma Dalton sat at the table, a heavy leather pouch of silver dollars resting near the unsigned deed. Mattie Jarvis stood in the corner, sullen and quiet, having been severely reprimanded by Wilma, but not yet fired. Joshua stood by the stove, pouring coffee. When a hand asked about trail conditions, Eugenia nodded toward Joshua. When another asked about flour, Joshua nodded toward Eugenia. Neither spoke over the other. By the third exchange, the room had begun to treat their partnership as fact. When the last of the men had been served, Wilma Dalton tapped her fingers on the table. "All right, Mrs. Ogden, the county is thawing out. The contract is on the table. I'll add 20% to the price, seeing as your high ground is the only thing that didn't freeze solid." The cabin fell silent. Mattie Jarvis sneered from the corner. Eugenia picked up the unsigned deed. She didn't rip it. She folded it neatly in half, then in half again, and handed it back to Wilma. "The cabin is not for sale, Mrs. Dalton," Eugenia said, her voice carrying to every corner. "The trail crews do not need another Dalton storehouse. They need a station answerable to no ranch. I am keeping the high ground. I am running the winter supply line." Wilma frowned. "You cannot run a winter line alone. The work will break you by January." "I won't be alone," Eugenia said. She turned to Joshua. Her look held no command and no plea. It was a risk offered openly, and it frightened him more than any contract ever had. "Joshua Boyd is staying," Eugenia announced. "He's not a hired hand. He's my partner in this station. He knows the trails, he knows the weather,
And he knows how to listen when it matters."
The ranchers murmured. Joshua's heart struck hard against his ribs. He had spent his life trying to be useful enough not to be discarded. In front of the county, Eugenia had named his skills, then chosen the man beneath them. Wilma Dalton looked at Joshua, calculating. She was a businesswoman who hated losing an asset. "Boyd," she said, "Jarvis is on thin ice. Come back to the Dalton ranch. I'll make you head winter foreman. Double the pay of your last contract. You don't have to scrape by on a ridge with a widow." It was the offer Joshua had spent 5 years breaking his back to earn. Recognition from the biggest ranch in the county. Joshua looked at the leather pouch of silver. Then he looked at Eugenia, who was holding her breath, her hands gripping the edge of the flour bin. "I thank you for the offer, Mrs. Dalton," Joshua said. His voice held none of its usual joke. "I spent a long time trying to be a man who needed nobody, so nobody would notice when they no longer needed me. I do not want your foreman's post. I want this ridge. I want this supply line." He crossed the room and took Eugenia's flour-dusted hand. "And if she will have a fool who finally learned to listen, I want the woman who runs it." Eugenia's breath broke into a small Her fingers closed hard around his. "I said partner, Joshua. I meant all of it." Matty Jarvis, from the corner.
"You're both fools. You'll freeze before February." Jarvis grabbed his hat and stormed toward the door. As he yanked it open, he caught the edge of his boot on the threshold. He stumbled forward, catching himself on the porch post. As he did, something dislodged from the deep pocket of his heavy winter coat and tumbled onto the floorboards. It was a strip of red canvas, frayed at the edges, with thick black thread stitched along the hem. The cabin went dead silent. Everyone recognized the fabric. It was the flag Eugenia used to mark her wagon. A low murmur rolled through the room. "Thief," one rancher said beneath his breath. 2 men who had been standing near Jarvis stepped away from him. Another set down his coffee and turned his shoulder, refusing even to meet Jarvis's eyes. By the time Wilma Dalton rose, Jarvis stood alone beside the open door. Her face was a mask of cold fury. "Mr. Jarvis," she said, her voice lethal, "I told you I buy what I want. I do not steal it, and I do not tolerate liars who sabotage my neighbors to force a sale." Wilma pointed toward the vast expanse of the Texas brush. "Pack your gear. You are off Dalton land by sundown." Jarvis looked around. No one defended him. No one laughed at a final insult waiting to leave his mouth. He spat into the snow and stalked away toward the buckboards. The ranchers dispersed, clapping Joshua's shoulder and tipping their hats to Eugenia. When the last wagon rolled down the ridge, the cabin belonged to the 2 of them again. Joshua stood by the table where Wilma's silver had been. Eugenia stopped inches from him. "Double the pay," she murmured. "Are you certain you do not wish to be a foreman?" "I have a better post." Joshua tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I get to keep the lantern lit." "That is not the whole of it." "What else?" "You come home before the snow." The word home stole every clever answer he owned. "I can do that, too." Eugenia studied him as though testing the promise. Then she rose on her toes and kissed him once, brief, warm, and certain. When she drew back, Joshua was still holding his breath. "You may breathe in here without paying for it," she reminded him. That won a laugh from him, low and helpless. He bent his forehead to hers. "Then I reckon I am rich." 3 weeks later, Joshua saw the northern sky turn the color of bruised iron while he was setting a trail marker below the ridge. The wind shifted,
Snow began to catch in the mesquite thorns. The old Joshua would have finished every marker before admitting the weather had spoken. This time, he tied off the last strip of cloth, gathered an armful of kindling from the shed, and went home. The porch lantern was already burning when he reached the cabin. Before his knuckles touched the door, the iron bar lifted from inside. Eugenia opened it with flour on her hands and a question in her eyes. She looked past him at the falling snow, then back at his dry coat and ice-free beard. "I saw the sky turn," Joshua said. "Came straight home." Without arguing with it. Not once. He held out the kindling. "I thought you might wish to mark the occasion."
She took the bundle, but she did not step aside at once. "And if I had not needed wood?" Joshua looked at the warm room beyond her, at the dough board, the iron stove, and the chair that now stood beside hers, as if it had always belonged there. "Then I would have come anyway." Her expression softened. She caught his coat and drew him across the threshold before the wind could touch his back. The first storm had driven Joshua to her door. The second found him there by choice.